These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? What makes a painting a masterpiece? That is, of course, a subjective judgment, but there are some paintings so important, so iconic, that they come to represent an age or a culture or a nation. And it's these kind of pictures which very often form the centerpiece of the great museums and galleries of the world. All around the globe, there are images which speak to a nation in ways that no others can match. And here in Amsterdam, there is a canvas loved by the Dutch like no other. This colossal gallery at the heart of the vast and beautiful Rijksmuseum doesn't just contain the most important painting in Dutch history, it was actually built around it. In what feels like a huge secular chapel dedicated to Dutch art, there hangs Rembrandt's world-famous and utterly stupendous Night Watch. This was an act of risk-taking, almost of arrogance, created by the greatest Dutch artist at the very height of his powers. Now, it's nothing short of a national treasure. So what is it? It's a group portrait of a militia company, what you might call a platoon of Amsterdam's People's Army. There are 16 men visible in all. We know most of their names. Right at the center with that magnificent white ruff is Frans Banning Kok, the commander of the militia, giving the order to advance. And beside him in the canary yellow is Willem van Ruttenberg, his lieutenant. All around the picture, there are different things going on. There's a dog barking, there's a young girl staring into the distance, there's a man cleaning his musket. Somebody else right in the center has fired his musket by mistake and nearly hit in somebody else's hat. Rembrandt's characters feel so alive, they could almost jump off the canvas. But if they did, they wouldn't get very far. Now, if you've been watching really carefully, you may have noticed there is a strange big glass box around it. Now, why is that? And the answer is, it is being restored, properly for the first time in more than 40 years. For your average masterpiece, any major restoration would be carried out as far away from the prying eyes of the public as possible. But the Night Watch isn't average, it's not allowed to skulk or to take time out. People care about this picture so much that they're prepared to watch it being restored. If they're not prepared literally to watch paint dry, then they're prepared to watch varnish dry, which you must admit is kind of unusual. So what is it about this collection of rather chaotic, strutting, striding, would-be unprofessional soldiers from another age in their impressive collection of strange hats and weird party clothes that gets so many people so emotional, so committed? It's a mystery that spans more than 300 years, takes in an artist's triumphant rise and tragic fall, and almost sees the Night Watch forgotten forever. This painting's story begins in a period of unrivaled creativity in Dutch art, made by new money and cutthroat competition.
The Netherlands in the 17th century was a very, very particular environment because it had this growing, flourishing art market.
You could buy a painting just for your weekly wage. And paintings were sold at markets, you know, alongside kitchenware, chickens. So these weren't just objects for the extremely wealthy, but anyone could own works of art.
This was a world of unequaled artistic production. Make it new, make it fast, make it different, with groundbreaking changes in technique, perspective and subject. Born in July 1606, Rembrandt had arrived into the Dutch Golden Age.
Rembrandt was born in the Dutch town of Leiden, which is about half an hour away from Amsterdam. And he was born in a pretty kind of bourgeois family.
His father was a miller, big family, lots of children. They managed to afford to send him to the local Latin school, so he learnt languages, he learnt about religion.
But there was really only one thing that interested the young Rembrandt. His itch, his instinct, his determination was to be an artist. And at 14, he began his apprenticeship.
He entered the workshop of a local artist, and that's where he learned, as it were, the craft.
He would have learned how to draw, how to use colour, how to mix and make his own paints. It doesn't appear that he just wakes up and is suddenly a brilliant artist, but rather, in his early works, with our own eyes, we can see him progressing.
Rembrandt's first canvases are full of mistakes, but each and every one ripples with ambition. They show daring colours, bold textures, and above all, an unusual approach to lighting. He was a young artist who wanted urgently to be different, to produce a style that was his alone. This was the formative period for the young Rembrandt, and much of the thinking and the skill you can see in the Night Watch goes back to the Leiden years, when he was working on the consistency of his paint and finding new ways to portray light in a more dynamic fashion.
His early masterpiece from that period, Judas Returning the 30 Pieces of Silver, is spectacular because it is all about creating the drama of the scene and emphasizing the drama through very dramatic lighting. Also, when you look at his very early self-portraits, there is one where almost his entire face is in shadow.
It was this painting, created when Rembrandt was in his early 20s, that put him on the map. No one had painted themselves in quite the same way before. This was one of the first of more than 80 self-portraits Rembrandt would create across his lifetime. And it brought the young painter to the attention of some of the most influential art brokers in the area. But soon, even his hometown wasn't big enough to contain Rembrandt's ambition. What this single-minded artist had wanted from birth was to stand out, and for that, he'd have to try himself on a far bigger stage.
There's so much opportunity in Amsterdam. Those most prestigious commissions, those were to be found in the big city.
If you really wanted to get big-time clients, then you had to go to Amsterdam. That's where the riches really were.
Rembrandt moved to a studio in Amsterdam in 1631. To put it simply, this aspiring young painter was following the money. During the Golden Age, Amsterdam was already overflowing with talented artists competing for fame and fortune. Joining them, Rembrandt was making a supremely bold move that would put him step by steady step on the road to the Night Watch. The Night Watch is one of the most famous paintings in the world, the jewel in the crown of Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum. And it's easy to see why. This is a canvas bursting with life, brimming with stories and hints of intrigue, one of which is the identity of a half-hidden face only just emerging from the shadows.
Now, of the 34 different people in the picture, there is one who technically shouldn't be there at all. He's absolutely dead center, right up towards the top. A very, very distinctive snub nose, a little round, inquiring, slightly cheeky eye. It is, of course, Rembrandt himself. Like Alfred Hitchcock, he's put himself into the film, as it were.
The Night Watch shows a glimpse of an artist at the exhilarating peak of his power and ambition. Just over 10 years earlier, he'd arrived in Amsterdam, desperate to make his fortune.
Amsterdam would have been very exciting in the 17th century. It's loud, it's busy, it was a real metropolis. And for artists, that represented a huge opportunity.
War with the Spanish Empire was over, Dutch ships crisscrossed the world, and now the city was packed with wealthy merchants, eager to spend their fortunes on portraits for their brand new townhouses. Fresh in from Leiden, which itself had been besieged by the Spanish, here was a painter who could offer something new.
Rembrandt kind of burst onto the scene and quite quickly got quite important commissions.
He was one of the first artists to capture physical expressions across a face. He painted portraits as though he could penetrate the person and get their personality.
He uses highlights so cleverly that you see that wet bit at the bottom of the eyelid, and the wrinkles around the eyes and so forth are so acutely observed.
These are very impactful pieces. He breathes life into his sitters, and other artists are just not at that same level at that time.
From his very first commission, it was clear that Rembrandt's work was different to everything else around him. He painted faces bathed in light and shadow, used the wrong end of his brush to scratch individual hairs into the paint, and became a master of touchably real surfaces. But most important, with a skill that would become vital to the success of the Night Watch, he depicted his sitters with a fresh immediacy.
There is a kind of ruddy, earthy realism about the faces. These are actual, living, breathing, sweating people that you could have met in the streets of Amsterdam, and there is no mistaking that at all.
Suddenly, this provincial miller's boy was the most popular portraitist in the city. And yet, always hungry for the next advance, Rembrandt needed more. Private commissions were fine, but he really wanted to create work on a bigger scale. He wanted to be properly noticed.
I think his first major success was the anatomy lesson of Nicholas Tulp. That was painted in 1632, and that was a very public commission. It was a way of marketing himself. And I think people would have seen that and thought, yes, that's the man who I want to paint my portrait too.
Rembrandt's first multi-portrait painting was a taste of the Night Watch to come, and it reveals his swelling ego. For the first time, he simply signed himself Rembrandt, audaciously assuming the same one-name celebrity label as Leonardo, Michelangelo, or Raphael. He saw himself as the rising hero of the Amsterdam art scene. What Rembrandt wanted now was a lifestyle to match. In 1634, he married the love of his life, Saskia van Uylenburg, and the glamorous young couple threw themselves into enjoying Rembrandt's good fortune.
They enjoyed life. They went out, they spent, they lived a very lavish lifestyle.
Rembrandt was very confident. He was spending lots of money. He was quite flash. He was very pleased that he was earning this money and saw that this was not going to end, so he could just spend it as it came.
He was living the high life.
Fancy clothes, luxurious meals. Rembrandt, it seemed, could shell out for anything his heart desired, including this princely three-story townhouse in the most sought-after area of the city. Now a popular Amsterdam museum, Dr. Lodewijk de Koekkoek is its director.
Rembrandt bought this house in 1639, and by that time he was the most famous artist in Amsterdam, and he was very wealthy. It cost 13,000 guilders, which was a fortune in that time. And this was the most opulent and large house in the whole street.
Rembrandt's spending, however, didn't stop here. Every time he finished painting, he'd pick up his wallet and head out shopping, filling his new house with curious purchases.
This room is Rembrandt's art cabinet, Kunstkabinett in Dutch. And this is where he shows his ambition, he shows his extreme drive and his fascination for beautiful objects.
He was something of a spenderholic, and his tastes were quite eclectic. So he buys things like armor,
Venetian glass, seashells,
stuffed animals, and bits of coral.
We don't know how much he spent. It must have been a fortune.
And in his new mansion, there was one room that was more important than any other.
Now, this was, of course, the largest room in the house. This is the grand studio. The light is fantastic. It's northern light, and it would have reflected beautifully into the studio. And of course, light, dark and light, chiaroscuro, very important in Rembrandt's work.
The high creativity of the master painter needed to be matched with the basic haggling business of funding his lifestyle. To sell himself and win the big commissions, Rembrandt needed to look the part.
This is the grand entrance hall. We call it the voorhuis, the front house. It would have been the grand entrance next to the street. And these were sort of the public areas where visitors were allowed in and where Rembrandt showed the opulence of his household, but also his success as a painter. And it would have been really set to impress. It would have helped close deals on paintings.
It's most likely to have been here that in 1640, after almost a decade working in Amsterdam, Rembrandt was approached for his biggest commission yet, the Night Watch.
So the Night Watch was commissioned by the Kloveniersdolen, which was the headquarter of the civic militia, and they commissioned it for their Great Hall.
The civic militia were close-knit groups of citizen soldiers, a kind of dad's army standing by to protect their communities from Spanish attack. And the way their portraits were captured was a tradition unique to the 17th century. For years, they'd been painted by the most established artists of the day in a similar style, the men dressed up in their finest clothes, arranged in a simple line like a school photo or a bizarre bus queue. But in 1640, when the group from District 2 decided to commission their portrait, rather than go with a reliable regular, they turned to Amsterdam's edgy celebrity, even though Rembrandt had never tackled anything like this before. Carla Ohers is an expert in art history.
They were vain men. They wanted the portraits to be done by a famous portrait painter. Rembrandt in those days was really like a superstar. So they were commissioning their group portrait with him because they wanted to have their portrait done by a famous artist.
The company leader, brash enough to put his portrait into the hands of the radical young Rembrandt, was pink-faced, red-haired Captain Frans Banning Kok.
It's a name I think every Dutch person knows because he is the main character in the Night Watch, the head of the civic militia group. He was in charge.
As tradition decreed, Banning Kok would have wanted his expensive commission to capture his men as war heroes, even if the reality was somewhat different.
Originally, they were defending the city in times of war. So in that period, the war against Spain. But when Rembrandt was doing the Night Watch, the Spanish troops were gone. My opinion, they were not real soldiers anymore. There was a sense of nostalgia. The Dutch people were very respectful towards them and grateful towards them for what they had done in the past. But what was there left for them to do? They were, in general, rich, important people. We know about them as Old Boys Network, a sort of Rotary Club or Lions Club. They were quite well known because of their, well,
gatherings in which they were drinking and eating and maybe gambling and giving each other good positions within the society.
They may have done more networking and drinking than fighting, but the importance of the militia was still deeply ingrained in their communities and their minds. This was a young country which had just freed itself from the Spanish Empire by fighting. But Rembrandt couldn't bring himself to copy what had come before him, even if radical reinvention would add extra difficulty to an already tricky brief.
You have to paint anywhere between 10 and 20 guys, but that makes for a really boring composition if you have to just to line them up. So the challenge for the artist really was to turn this into an interesting composition where you have the impression that they maybe interact with each other, that they talk to each other, but they also all have to look at the viewer in order to be recognized. So it seems like an almost impossible task.
This was why most artists responded with a traditional, simple arrangement. Even then, there were added complications.
They paid for their individual portraits, so the more money you were paying, the best position you could get.
The cheapest option would be at the sides of the painting, in profile, maybe just your head or a bit of your eye. And the most expensive would be your whole figure, doing something majestic, doing something very dramatic.
With the Night Watch, Rembrandt was juggling 18 different figures and egos, and the position of his subjects wasn't his only challenge, because this work was not intended to stand alone. 6 other Dutch artists had also been commissioned to make major group portraits for the same room, and by the time Rembrandt started painting, 4 had already been finished.
They had all played by the rules. This was entirely competent bus-cue painting, and therefore, for the ever-ambitious Rembrandt, more than a little boring.
And so the artist who'd based his entire career on being different decided to create an entirely new type of militia portrait. When it was finally unveiled, the Night Watch would indeed be a painting completely unlike any of its predecessors. In 1640, Rembrandt began work on a painting that would come to define him, the Night Watch. This was the only civic militia portrait he would ever produce, but true to form, Rembrandt scrapped convention, instead taking the biggest risk of his career.
What Rembrandt did, which was very different, was to place his figures as if they're in an actual battle. It actually looks like they're about to go to war. And he constructs a narrative around them. He presents what is a portrait more like a history painting. That had never been done before and was completely game-changing.
This was amazing. This was like watching a movie, and because the figures are life-size, you really feel as though you've got to get out the way because they're going to come towards you and you're in danger. You're in the way.
He has created a very unusual and risky composition, throwing aside all the usual rules about lining people up so that he can achieve the illusion of this militia company literally marching out of the wall, off the canvas and towards the viewer. And to do that, he has made some very strange decisions about the lighting.
Most other artists lit their civic guard portraits pretty simply, a bright overhead glare. But now Rembrandt tried something very different. Shadows shroud much of the canvas, and instead he picked out his main characters almost as if with spotlights. If you look just here, for example, you can see the light illuminating Koch's outstretched hand, casting a shadow which cuts across the Amsterdam coat of arms embroidered on his lieutenant's jacket.
It's a bit like a theatre director or a film director's lighting, and that gives the picture a dynamism that Rembrandt can't have been sure when he started it would actually achieve.
The whole painting is a performance, and Rembrandt has even provided his own soundtrack. A musket goes off behind the captain. There's the rat-a-tat-tat of a drum. A dog seems to bark. It's a cacophony of noise, action, and movement.
And here is the final, almost ludicrous risk that Rembrandt is taking with this picture. This is a militia. These are would-be soldiers. They are men who want to be remembered as soldiers, dangerous men, except that this must be the least dangerous, least lethal, least threatening group of so-called would-be soldiers in the history of art. They are ridiculous. One's firing his gun by mistake, all their weapons are pointing in different directions, and their mascot girl is laughing at them. Rembrandt is telling a story, but it's not the story that militia expect. It is an entirely different story.
And it was one he had to tell carefully in order to tread a fine line between honour and insult. This was a far from straightforward painting to complete, and for nearly 2 years Rembrandt worked on the canvas relentlessly. In July 1642, the Night Watch was finally finished, and with great expectation installed in the militia group's Guild Hall. I think it's fair to say they were in for a surprise.
It wasn't what they expected at all. You know, they didn't know how to react to this drama. Are they meant to laugh at it? Are they meant to be aghast at it? Are they meant to be in awe of the fact that every one of those people is captured through the expression and the personality and the stance?
I think some of the sitters in the picture were quite unhappy about how they were shown because they did not get the prominence that they had expected.
But it must have been admired because it was immediately put on the wall. Rembrandt was paid for it in full, and the head of the Civic Guard had several copies made for himself to have in his own home and to give to friends.
The Night Watch may have been unveiled to a mixed reception, but no one could deny that this was daring, unique, bold. Rembrandt had taken a huge gamble, and he'd created something extraordinary. Everyone could see that. But now, just as Rembrandt triumphed artistically, disaster befell him at home as his beloved Saskia died.
Rembrandt really loved his wife Saskia. That was a period of great melancholy for Rembrandt. He was devastated when she died.
Commercial success seemed to mean so much less without Saskia to share it. A year before, she'd given birth to the couple's only surviving child, a boy they'd named Titus. And now Rembrandt faced raising his son alone. But his time of disaster wasn't over.
After the Night Watch, which really represents the peak of his career, Rembrandt's career goes into something of a decline. In the decade that follows, his commissions significantly decrease.
Public taste changed. People wanted a little less brown, something more fashionable, something more frivolous, what they considered to be lighter, brighter paintings.
And I think Rembrandt couldn't or didn't want to keep up.
For the first time in his working life, Rembrandt was out of fashion, out of commissions, and therefore, pretty soon, out of money.
Rembrandt continued to spend extravagantly even after his fortunes were in decline. And eventually, in 1652, his creditors said, "That's enough, we're calling in our debts." And Rembrandt couldn't cope. Eventually, he had to sell his house and possessions at auction and was forced into bankruptcy.
Rembrandt had to move from the big house he'd bought with Saskia in Amsterdam to a very rough part of town where he lived for the last 13 years of his life.
The man who'd once been Amsterdam's richest painter now cowered in the city's shadiest suburb. It had only been a handful of years since he'd produced his masterpiece, but his life was now unrecognisable.
It was a real fall from grace. In order to recover some of his debts, he's even forced to sell Saskia's tomb in 1664.
That must have caused him great melancholy and trauma. She was the love of his life.
Rembrandt's livelihood was hanging by a thread, and yet, wrinkle by wrinkle, failure by failure, he magicked disaster into triumph, The realism he'd brought to Banningcock's men now applied to his own ageing features, creating what are now seen as his most moving work. Even now, worse was still to come. In 1668, Titus, his son, was killed by a plague. There was simply nothing left for Rembrandt. He struggled on for one more year before dying penniless and alone at the age of 63. He was so forgotten by the town that had once loved him, there wasn't even an official notice of his death.
In spite of the fame Rembrandt achieved in his lifetime, he was buried in a pauper's grave. So it's an unmarked grave, and it doesn't exist today. You can't find it.
All that remains of his final resting place is a plaque, erected in 1909 in the Westerkerk Church, acknowledging his forlorn death.
It's frankly very moving to be here, to reflect on Rembrandt's own life, all the hard work, the years and years of toil, the terrible disappointments, the struggles, the disasters, the bankruptcies, and towards the end of his life, that sense of a great dark cloud hanging over everything. What would he have thought had he been able to be here now and realised that his greatest and most complicated work is at the heart of Amsterdam, at the heart of the greatest Dutch museum, and in many ways at the heart of the Dutch people?
But before the Night Watch could embark on its triumphant progress to Dutch national icon, it would, a little like its creator, suffer its own humiliation. 73 years after it was first hung in the militia HQ, the colossal canvas was moved to Amsterdam's palatial town hall, now a palace. Alice Takken is its curator of exhibitions.
So this is the room where the Night Watch was hung in 1715, when it was taken from the Kloveniersstoelen to here. This was the office of the colonels of the Great War Council.
But in bringing the Night Watch to its new home, the officials faced a rather tricky problem.
The Night Watch was placed in between those two doors behind me. The problem was, though, that the space between the doors was too small. So they took the pragmatic route and cut it down on all sides.
In what must be one of the most brutal truncations in art history, Rembrandt's glorious Night Watch was chopped down to fit its new home.
We know what was lost on the Night Watch because of a small-scale copy made by Gerrit Lundens. The portions that were taken off were actually essential to understand the painting. So what we see on the copy is that the guard company is passing through a city gate and over a bridge over a canal. So that makes it very logical that all the people are moving.
So they cut off about 2 feet from the left, which took off a couple of people, and it cut off an area at the top, which meant that all the wonderful perspective and the archway and the rods and the banners, that was all not as intended.
We have no idea what happened to the pieces that they cut off. They cut those pieces off because they thought they weren't that important. So in all probability, they just threw them out. We have no idea. Maybe they'll turn up sometime.
By the end of the 18th century, Rembrandt was long dead and forgotten. His remains lost in a pauper's grave, his most important work butchered to fit its space in a gloomy council chamber. It seemed this masterpiece must surely be consigned to history, and yet there's an extraordinary twist to the story still to come. By the turn of the 19th century, Rembrandt's Night Watch, the work he'd been most proud of, the one he'd produced right at the peak of his extraordinary career, was hanging in an out-of-the-way council chamber, a fraction of its original size. But this all but forgotten masterpiece had not reached the end of the road just yet.
Now, among many other things, Rembrandt was a storyteller, and I think he would have been delighted that his greatest painting, his most complicated painting, is not only valued around the world for its own qualities, but also for the extraordinary and, frankly, bizarre story behind it.
And the next chapter of this canvas's tale begins 300 miles from Amsterdam in the world's artistic capital at the time, Paris. By the later 19th century, a new artistic movement was gripping the French, the Impressionists, a radical group of then young avant-garde artists painting real life as they saw it. They much preferred Rembrandt's work to the cold academic traditions of their own city. They loved the rich warmth of his shadows, the immediacy and the realism of his sitters. This new wave of painters felt a kinship with the old Dutch master.
There's a real reappreciation of Rembrandt, and I think people like the romantic, wild side of Rembrandt, you know, especially those late works where he's really painting with very thick paint. What was once out of fashion becomes more loved.
Certainly his humanity in the pictures, his talent for getting through the surface to something deeper in the sitter, and his compositions, the lighting and so forth, has certainly impressed and influenced many artists.
Van Gogh called him a magician, writing, "Rembrandt says things for which there are no words in any language." And as his status and influence soared around the world, the Dutch too began to notice. The prodigal son was, at long last, welcomed home.
He was rediscovered, if you like, and then became a national icon as the archetype of Dutchness. He became the national hero.
And as Rembrandt came back in vogue, so too did his most patriotic painting, a reminder of the days when the Dutch had fought an empire to found their citizens' republic. In 1885, Amsterdam's brand new Rijksmuseum prepared to open to the public. The Night Watch was top of the curator's priority list. And they had a much more radical solution than their 18th century counterparts about how to fit this enormous canvas to the wall. They decided to build it a whole new wing of its own.
This gallery was specifically built for the Night Watch. You know, this kind of what resembles a church interior. It's a gallery of honor, and you walk in a ceremonial way up to the high point, which any normal church be the altar. At the end of the Unveiled is then the great masterpiece, which is the Night Watch.
Rembrandt's masterpiece was no longer just being displayed, it was being worshipped. Resting in the very heart of the new National Gallery, this painting was now a national treasure.
Rembrandt painted the Night Watch to raise pride in anyone who looks at it, civic pride, to be proud of your town, proud of your country. And centuries later, it still does that. It does exactly that for Amsterdam and for the rest of the Netherlands.
That painting's so loved by the Dutch because it's part of their history and it shows, you know, we're heroes and we're here to protect and we're dashing and we're frivolous and we're action-packed, we're superheroes.
Night Watch mania has gripped the Dutch nation ever since. Nowadays, Rembrandt's canvas is visited by more than 2 million people every single year. It's so loved that when the Rijksmuseum reopened after major refurbishment works in 2013, the painting was welcomed back on display with enormous fanfare.
People go wild. The painting's paraded through the streets of Amsterdam. There's tremendous celebration.
The Night Watch is transported in this huge wooden crate, and there's children there waving flags and people are throwing flowers, and it's almost like the World Cup final footballers have arrived home.
And the extraordinary tributes to this beloved canvas haven't stopped there. To mark the museum's reopening, this group of actors in southern Holland brought the Night Watch to a shopping centre in a way that would surely have made Rembrandt chuckle. It's a love affair that shows no sign of abating.
It tells a story in a way that no other painting has ever done. It tells a fragment of history with action.
It's crazy that a painting in the 21st century is treated with such adoration, but this is such an iconic painting, and Rembrandt is such a symbol of Holland and Amsterdam that it holds a place like no other work can.
A national icon, absolutely. But for me, it's so much more. The Night Watch is a painting about perfectly ordinary people standing up to tyranny. And that's a theme that can speak for everyone.
This is a picture which comes out of the Dutch experience, but it's not for the Dutch, it's for everybody. Because what does it show? It shows a group of very human humans, strutting, ridiculous, absurd. They are silly, as I am silly, as you are silly. But they're coming together for a common purpose. They're all doing their own thing in this picture, but it shows the moment just before they do one single thing, marching out into the light together. This shows what happens when a free people come together for the common good. It is therefore the greatest Republican painting ever made, a great painting of democracy and ultimately of tolerance. It shows what happens at that very moment when we stop doing our own little self-absorbed, selfish things and come together to do one big thing all together. And at that moment, the encroaching dark, which seems so scary, which surrounds them and surrounds every one of us, suddenly doesn't seem quite so frightening after all.
Next time, Tate Britain's most popular and most haunting canvas.
This is not a pretty story. It's a young woman's suicide by drowning.
A painting in which life mirrored art.
The fact that Lizzie Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism.
And that even inspired a grave robbing.
He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin.
The remarkable story of Millais' Ophelia. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe,
there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power.
Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? The National Gallery in London is a treasure trove of more than 2,000 paintings. Some of these canvases make us feel patriotic or devout. Others fill us with horror.
But there's one particular painting hanging on these walls which has caused blood pressures to rise in private and in public ever since it was first made nearly 400 years ago. It's Diego Velázquez's Rokeby Venus.
It shows the mythological goddess of love, Venus, reclining very much at her leisure, gazing into a mirror held by her son, Cupid. The Rokeby Venus, it got the name a little more than 200 years ago in honor of its last private owner.
What is really good art? Really good art, I would say, is art that has a physical effect on the viewer. So your heart rate goes up, you feel goosebumps at the back of your neck, the hairs on the back of your neck go up. You have a physical, emotional reaction to what you're seeing, and it might be fear or horror or whatever. In this case, it's certainly a very, very strong emotional reaction. You watch people watching this picture, and they stop and they gasp, and you can tell they are emotionally affected.
The subtle magic of this particular Venus is all about watching and feeling. We look at her looking at a reflection of herself, or perhaps is she watching us standing in the gallery?
When it was made, this kind of image was outlawed, forbidden, and certainly never to be seen in public. And then many, many years later, when it was already hanging on these walls, it was subjected to a ferocious physical attack. And the scars are still visible even today if you look hard enough.
The story of how this simple-looking painting has triggered so many different and powerful responses is itself quite a tale. And it's one that begins with unlikely origins in that glittering era when Spain dominated the world.
The Spanish Golden Age was an extraordinary time in European history. Spain was an empire. Spanish territories extended beyond Iberia to Italy, to Northern Europe, and to the Americas.
It's conquest, colonization, expansion, and trade. They have an unbelievable amount of money, silver and gold, coming from the New World that could pay for the arts and, the patronage of arts.
It was into this world of massive wealth and huge opportunity that Velázquez was born in 1599 in Seville.
He came from quite a large family, one of 6 children, very educated. He was very talented from a very, very early age. And when he was aged 11, he went and studied art as an apprentice to the local artist.
The city was famed for its flourishing art scene, and the young Velázquez's new mentor and future father-in-law, Francisco Pacheco, was an influential figure across Seville. Although, as these 2 paintings show, the first of a merchant couple by Pacheco, and the second one of Pacheco by Velázquez, it didn't take long for the young man to surpass his rather wooden master, a talent that would culminate in the Rokeby Venus.
Velázquez is a unique artist. So he's often seen as being astonishing illusionism. His pictures look real, but they're not.
He didn't follow what every other artist was doing. He liked to use loose handling of paint. He used to use long brushes, for example, which was very radical at the time, but it gave him that flick that he wanted, that sort of impressionistic flick. He had this ability to keep paint looking fresh, as though it was still wet, like double cream. There's parts of it that you feel as though you want to just go up and lick. They look so luscious.
He was already a technically astonishing painter when he left Pacheco to set up in his own studio and accept commissions when he was just 18 years old.
We don't know much about his personality, but he was driven, he was ambitious, he was talented, he was loved by everybody, by all his patrons.
And also his subject matter was unconventional. He liked to use real people that he knew and was familiar with. And he would go to the taverns and he would draw and paint the people there.
He actually had a passion for reality, a passion for textures, a passion for the things that were around him.
By his early 20s, Velázquez was the prime painter of Seville. And if you look at those early paintings, it's clear that he was obsessed by the real. They're paintings of the stink and the dust of the streets.
He captured ordinary, everyday life with remarkable verve and energy. But the deeply ambitious man who'd paint the Rokeby Venus wanted, above all else, to paint the extraordinary. His opportunity finally came in 1623, when his subjects would quite definitely be keeping their clothes on.
Velázquez was summoned to Madrid to paint the portrait of the new young king, Philip IV, and this was a huge risk. Do it really well, and what follows? Money, obviously, but also fortune and reputation. Bog it up, however, and it is instant humiliation, immediate failure, and skulking back to the shadows for the rest of your dibbity-dabbity painterly life.
The National Gallery's Rokeby Venus is a jewel from the Spanish Golden Age. It's the work of Diego Velázquez, one of the most precocious, ambitious and brilliant painters the world has seen.
I think the wonderful thing about Velázquez as a painter is the way he just loads his brush with a bit of paint and uses no more than he actually absolutely needs. It's an extraordinary self-confidence in his painting. The brushwork is quite loose. The edges of Venus's body are almost impossible to pinpoint. They're the opposite of the very hard drawing of the Renaissance you get so often. And so if you look at the little strip of cloth being held by the Cupid over the mirror, there's just tiny little flickers of paint, tiny little bits of white and pink, almost no paint there at all, and certainly it's not delicately painted in because he didn't need to. He gave the impression. This is remarkably modern painting.
It almost feels like an instinct he was born with, but Velázquez would need more than that to make a successful career in 17th century Spain.
From the time he first stepped into an artist's studio, aged about 11, it was clear that Velázquez had real talent, and he didn't have to wait very long into his maturity for his first big break. Because in 1623, aged just 24, he was summoned to Madrid to paint the custard-faced, slack-jawed, girlishly lipped and intensely vain king.
The 18-year-old Philip IV had been on the throne for a couple of years, but he was already a prolific patron to the few artists permitted to loiter around his court. One of them, Rodrigo de Villandrando, painted this portrait of him just before he became king. If Velázquez could nail this all-or-nothing commission, he'd be set up for life.
The two most important patrons in Spain during the 17th century were the church and the court. One always hoped for a royal commission. This is what most artists strove to achieve, to be invited to Madrid to paint for the king.
It was a dream come true for Velázquez. His subject, however, was about as challenging as could be.
I think it may have been difficult for Velázquez to paint a flattering portrait of Philip IV.
They say of the king that he only ever smiled 3 times in his whole life, and that he was very inward, kept himself to himself. If he was out at a public affair, very often people would do a double take because he was so still they thought it was a statue.
After weeks of working and no doubt taking a mighty deep breath, he unveiled his portrait to the wary king.
Philip was absolutely impressed. He said it was extraordinary, that it was amazing, that it was lifelike, and nobody ever painted like he did.
It was an amazing portrait. To see him in a painting as though he's human and actually got blood in his veins was something quite extraordinary.
He was so flattered, and he wanted to have Velázquez as the only painter who portrayed himself and his family.
For a man still only 24 years old, this was a remarkable rise to the heights of his profession. Velázquez immediately left Seville and set up shop at the king's lavish Madrid court.
Life inside the royal palace for Velázquez was amazing. He had his own studio, he had medical cover, he got a wage, food, lodgings. He was invited to be even wardrobe master to the royal family, decorator to the palace. He travelled around and bought works of art for the palace. He was treated as though he was royalty himself.
He particularly became King Philip's friend. Philip was very stiff to everybody else and courtly. He made this persona, but with Velázquez, he was very relaxed.
Velázquez's new patron was a rich king who loved him. Surely here was an artist who could now paint whatever he wanted, including a classical nude, as all recent great artists had done. Absolutely not. Why? Because this was the heyday of the infamous Spanish Inquisition.
Its purpose was to combat heresy and to maintain Catholic orthodoxy.
Founded in 1478, this was the most formidable force in the Spanish Empire. Religious fundamentalists, secret police, torturers, judges, juries, and executioners in a single organization.
It was extremely zealous. The Inquisition meted out dreadful tortures, the rack, or pouring gallons of water down people's throats, all in order to get them to confess to crimes that they maybe or maybe did not commit.
The Inquisition was absolutely feared in Spain. It created a climate of terror. It created that was the most terrible thing.
The Inquisition's tentacles reached into all areas of life, from everyday moral decisions to the standards of high art.
According to the rules of the Spanish Inquisition, producing images of female nudes was considered indecorous.
They were considered something that may provoke unwanted sex or even rape. So the power of the painting was more than just the paint. If you were found to have any of these paintings, you would be expelled from Spain. And of course, the paintings would have been destroyed.
To make things a little more complicated, his father-in-law, Francisco Pacheco, was in charge of assessing paintings on behalf of the Inquisition. And so it's easy to see for the time being why Velázquez didn't stray far from the palace. Besides, limited subject matter wasn't going to curb his vision.
As a court painter to the king, he was very close to the royal family. So he painted not only the King of Spain, but also the Queen and their children, and also dwarfs and jesters and other members of the Spanish royal household. What Velázquez brought to his portraiture was a heightened sense of realism. He was able to breathe life into his subjects and his sitters. And he was able to convey the illusion that what one was looking at was not just a painted likeness, but an actual living presence.
It was so real. It was so, lifelike. It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you. It was like a direct connection because of the way he depicted them.
And it's this dedicated, hard-boiled realism which makes all his painting, and this canvas in particular, so remarkable.
If there's one thing we know about Velázquez is again and again and again is an almost shocking directness, a realism. You see dirty feet, you see distended bellies, you see wine bottles dripping with water. Always it's the material and the real. And I think you see it again in the flesh of the Venus here. She is unquestionably, undoubtedly, a real living human being. There is blood coursing just below that skin.
It was to be more than 25 years before he'd get the chance to paint his Venus. That window of opportunity finally opened in 1649, when the king permitted the now 49-year-old painter to pack his easel and brushes and head for Italy.
Velázquez went to Italy in order to learn from Italian artists, from Renaissance artists, and also from his contemporaries.
Also to just have more experience outside the court that was very restrictive. He wanted to explore new subjects, which were not the royal family, and in Italy he could do this.
This journey to the heart of Rome was the chance to fulfill his greatest creative ambition, to paint a nude Venus in the classical tradition. But he still had to take on other commissions, and they didn't come much bigger than the one from the Vatican.
He painted a portrait of Pope Innocent X. Velázquez was very audacious, and he adds a layer of realism here in his portrayal of the Pope. If you look at the face, it's incredibly naturalistic in the way in which he portrays his expression, not idealizing his appearance because he had a very prominent nose, and also portraying him almost with a scowl. And it's thought that when the Pope laid eyes on this painting for the first time, he exclaimed, "È troppo vero," it's too real, it's too true.
Away from the suffocating constraints of life in Spain, here was finally the opportunity for which he'd waited most of his life. Velázquez squared his shoulders and began the Rokeby Venus.
Now, there are no records which tell us exactly where Velázquez was when he began work on the Rokeby Venus.
But when you look at what he'd have seen in Italy, it's not hard to see where his inspiration may have come from.
Here, for instance, is the sleeping hermaphrodite, or the Borghese hermaphrodite. It's actually an ancient classical statue which had been excavated. And it shows a woman lying in a very similar attitude to the Rokeby Venus, and we know that Velázquez took a bronze cast of this back with him to Madrid, so it clearly meant quite a lot to him. And then here we have two examples of the most blatant, full frontal nudes done up till then in Western art. This is Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, now sometimes attributed to Titian, and she's absolutely full frontal. And here, finally, is the very famous Venus of Urbino, painting definitely by Titian, and as it were, the reflection of the Rokeby Venus from the front rather than the back. In this case, Venus is full awake, and she's looking at us with a very frank expression indeed. And what we have to remember is that these are images that Velázquez could not possibly have seen in Madrid. They would have been forbidden. He had to see them in Rome.
We will never know for sure who his model was or how long he took to capture her, but what we do know is that Velázquez's painting took the traditional nude portrait into a new dimension. And for such a radical, substantial change, he used the very lightest of touches.
It's a very soft painting, very few colours in the image. It's really only pinks, greys and a bit of blue.
If you get up close to that painting, it's very difficult to distinguish one brush mark from another, which gives it this lovely sort of pearly quality. He's really fascinated by the whiteness or the paleness of her flesh. And he obviously deliberately uses, perhaps rather provocatively, the black sheet to enhance that sense of paleness. So it's quite a sexy picture.
But it's impossible to believe that this was just an erotic exercise for the painter. There is enigma and subtlety in this painting. It adds up to much more than the sum of its parts.
I mean, it's a really puzzling picture. It's deliberately ambiguous. It's unusual at the time in that he's presenting the nude from behind. Usually the nude was painted reclining, but facing the spectator.
But here she gazes back at the spectator via a mirror.
If you look at the reflection in the mirror doesn't quite add up, so it's not really a reflection of Venus. First of all, the face in the mirror is much older than Venus's, so that might be a way of saying nothing lasts forever, everything is temporary, and everything ages and gets uglier and drops south.
And if you actually look at the face of the Venus, she's got this sort of slight blush and quite a petite face, whereas the face in the mirror is much larger, it's blurred, and it's looking out at the spectator. It's sometimes described as the Venus effect, but the proportions seem to be all over the place, which adds to the mystery.
It's not especially clear whom she's looking at. And this is an open question. He deliberately leaves it open. He deliberately leaves it ambiguous. Is she looking at the spectator? Is she gazing at her own reflection?
The mirror is key to this image. Front and center, it's the focal point of the canvas. But more than that, from here, Venus can see exactly who's looking at her. Velázquez made a painting that's really all about how we look at it, the feelings we have in response to his subject.
Titian's nudes are often described as being unrealistically curvy, but Velázquez's Venus was frank. This is a real woman. You take the models and you add the Velázquez touch, material, direct, earthy, frank, blatant, and you get something that had never happened in quite this way in Western art before.
Velázquez loved his time in Italy, the free and easy ways of Italian life. Unfortunately for him, his year in the cultural sun couldn't last forever. King Philip IV was desperate for his return, so in early 1651, Velázquez finally headed back to Madrid. But what would he do with his newly painted Venus, a canvas that could get him into serious trouble with the Spanish Inquisition?
He rolled her up and took the Rokeby Venus back to Madrid, back home. Venus undraped in the lion's den. Risky. So why would Velázquez take such a gamble with his own personal safety for this image?
This remarkable 17th century masterpiece, popularly known as the Rokeby Venus, is by Diego Velázquez.
Velázquez was the great painter of the Spanish Golden Age. There was nobody who came within a country mile of Velázquez's ambition, the cheeky, fluid directness of his brush, and the sheer force of his intellect. And yet, amongst all those wonderful portraits, the mysterious court scenes, the battle paintings, the Rokeby Venus stands out alone.
Because nudes were outlawed by the Spanish Inquisition, Velázquez had painted her in Italy, but then he took the monumental gamble of returning to Madrid with his canvas. Why on earth did he take the risk? Well, he seems to have had a buyer lined up for it, and remarkably, the evidence is still there in black and white at Madrid's Casa de Alba archive. Dr. Mar Doval is a local Velázquez scholar.
This is the inventory written in 1651, the 1st of June, on the belongings of the Marquis of Elite. There are many entries, as you can see, and each number is possessions of the Marquis, and in this case, paintings. And the one important for us is this one, number 222. And in this case, it's very well described. It says, una pintura en lienzo, a painting on canvas, that's important, of a nude woman lying on clothes, pintada de espaldas, painted from the back, leaning on her right arm and looking at the mirror, held by the boy, de la mano de Velázquez, by the hand of Velázquez. We know that that picture was in that collection. And we know that picture was painted by Velázquez.
So who was the Marquess of Elite? Well, he was a well-known nobleman and a flamboyant roué. He did know a lot about art, and he knew what he liked.
He was an eccentric guy, an eccentric collector of women, an eccentric collector of art. He was one of the most important collectors in Spain.
He was a very powerful man. He was about 30 years younger than Velázquez, and he was very charismatic. He was apparently very ugly.
The Marquis, he wasn't a very handsome man, but he enjoyed life, and he liked women very much. Women and art. And he had a very impressive collection of art. paintings by Titians, Velázquez, from Raphael, and he wanted to have the best painters. And Velázquez was the king's painter.
He now had a prized new painting, but where could he display it without falling foul of the Inquisition's vice squad? Like many secrets, the answer is locked behind closed doors. Literally. The Spanish elite's solution for keeping their forbidden pleasures away from disapproving eyes were called salas reservadas.
They were started by Philip II, who had a huge collection of nude paintings, and they were secret rooms within the palace or in the houses of nobility where men who collected art could have their own secret nude paintings.
Philip IV increased the collection of nudes, and he would retire there after the siesta, after eating.
At the time, nude paintings of women would have been considered like top-shelf porn, you know, for male amusement, male pleasure.
These paintings were covered with curtains who were drawn if women were supposed to go there, like the Queen, for instance. But if men were there, obviously it was to be delighted by these nudes.
All of the rich, powerful men would have had these hidden secret chambers. And that's where they would retire for the evening, gone for hours or 2 minutes, depending.
And although it knew about the secret rooms, the Inquisition was checkmated, unable to get a grip on the fashion for secret salons, even if its clerical police suspected this was getting out of hand.
Most of the high clergy possessed these paintings called indecent pictures. So they couldn't really expel bishops or cardinals or even the king, from that matter. So there was a kind of double standards of doing public morality and personal taste.
His Venus had a fervent new admirer, but Velázquez returned to his fully clothed subjects at the royal court. The ideas he explored in the Rokeby Venus would reappear in his later works, most clearly in Las Meninas, one of his final portraits of the royal family.
The Rokeby Venus may be seen as a kind of dry-run precursor to Las Meninas because the two have in common the mirror and the way in which he manipulates the reflection in the mirror and opens up the possibilities for interpreting what we see in the painting. Where is the Venus's gaze directed, and where are the king and queen?
And in what is, on the face of it, an intimate family portrait, Velázquez has painted himself into the heart of the composition. He has, in effect, photobombed his employers.
He was implying that he was part of the family and introducing just reflections of the king and his wife in the background of the painting. You see someone dressed up as a nobleman in the act of painting. It's a kind of symbolism. It's a kind of metaphor that he finally achieved what he wanted.
4 years after finishing this painting, 61-year-old Velázquez died and was buried in a church which once stood in this square.
After Velázquez's death, he really does become one of the most famous Spanish artists who ever lived.
Centuries later, he was still held in the highest esteem. Picasso, Manet, Goya, they all looked back to Velázquez and said that he was the painter's painter, he was the greatest of them all. No one has surpassed him.
And a painting by the greatest of them all would always find a home. So it was, at the end of the 18th century, Venus became the property of another member of the political elite, a newly appointed Prime Minister, Manuel de Godoy.
Manuel Godoy had a collection of nudes following the tradition of the hidden displays.
The Inquisition was still actively hunting out immoral painting, but that threat didn't stop Godoy commissioning Francisco Goya to paint a nude for his collection. While he was inspired by Velázquez and his remarkable Venus, what Goya painted, known as the Maja, was altogether more risque.
There is no Cupid, there is no mirrors, there is nothing of that kind. The body is frontal in the Goya's Maja, and Velázquez is from the back. She's actually looking at us. She's engaging with the viewer directly and is inviting the viewer to enjoy her. So the eroticism in this is much clearer and less concealed.
It's said that Godoy owned Goya's naked Maja and had the Rokeby Venus together in one room. And that would have created a huge stir had people known.
The unpopular Godoy's enemies rejoiced in 1808 when, following a tip-off, his private booty room was raided. The Rokeby Venus was exposed to the hostile gaze of the Spanish Inquisition, and over the following years, Godoy was hauled into court.
He had to stand trial in front of the Inquisition, and he was asked why he had these paintings, and he said, well, he was an art lover, and he also said that they were following in the great traditions of other great artists like Tintoretto and Titian, but it didn't do any good.
The Inquisition forced him to name the artist behind the image far more scandalous than the Rokeby Venus, the naked Maja, and so Goya found himself dragged in to be questioned.
He tried to legitimize the portrayal of his nude by comparing it to the Rokeby Venus. He defended the quality and the fantastic composition and colors that Velázquez used at that time for him to emulate.
Goya turned around and said, well, no, actually, Velázquez did it before me, and Velázquez was the greatest painter, and I'm just following in his footsteps.
It was a clever defense. Velázquez was now beyond reproach, a Spanish hero for the ages who could do no wrong.
If he could paint a nude, then Goya could get away with it. And that was basically how he escaped from serious punishment by the Inquisition.
Velázquez's Venus had effectively saved Goya from potential exile. So the next chapter of this masterpiece's story is all the more surprising. Set as it is in Yorkshire. After he was disgraced, Godoy's collection was broken up and Venus was sold to another politician, John Morritt, MP of Rokeby Park, near Barnard Castle.
So the Rokeby Venus got her anglicised name because of Rokeby Park, where it ended up in the 19th century.
And it stays there on through different generations of the family, apparently hung above the chimney piece, so that when the connoisseurs came, they could steal a glance up at it, while ladies could avert their eyes away from the painting.
She might have changed country, ending up in a very different part of Europe from where she'd first started. But once again, the Rokeby Venus was hidden behind an elegant private door to be peeped at only by the house guests of Rokeby Park. She was like a courtesan, a kept woman, hidden behind high private walls, no peeking by the plebs.
The Rokeby Venus hung there for nearly a century before the Morritt family were forced to sell her to pay a massive tax bill in 1905.
Art dealers purchased the Rokeby Venus and then put her straight back on the market with a huge asking price of £45,000, which would be £5.5 million in today's money. They were going to have to shop around for a buyer.
But what would happen next to the Rokeby Venus? More politics and a nasty surprise. For the first 250 years of the Rokeby Venus's life, this enigmatic painting had been locked behind closed doors.
In 1905, this extraordinary piece was put up for sale, and in a shameless attempt to enthuse as many buyers as possible, the Rokeby Venus was sent off on her very first public tour.
Suddenly, the painting found itself displayed all over the country: Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh.
It's extraordinary because it goes from behind a sealed room where it's only for a select pair of male eyes into the public arena where everybody can come and see it for free. And they're amazed by it. And not just the subject matter, but also the painting technique.
Not everyone likes the painting. Some people think she's not a very attractive woman. No, she's ugly. She's too thin, she's too scrawny. But I think all this debate, just garners interest.
So when the news broke that it might be sold abroad, there was a public outcry to save the Venus for Britain.
The National Art Collection Fund launched a campaign to save it for the nation, knowing full well that the Treasury is not going to act and put up the funds to acquire the painting. So lots of people put in subscriptions.
The British public wanted to keep it here because it was such an astounding painting. You know, it's part of a great, important history, and we wanted it to be seen.
The cause seemed pretty hopeless, with the sums raised falling short, but then help came from an unexpected and royal direction.
The King, Edward VII, meets the shortfall by offering a donation and also a loan, which enables the Art Collection Fund to acquire the painting for the nation in 1906. It becomes the nation's Venus.
And the King wanted this national treasure saved so it could be admired by everyone.
It goes on public display for the first time in 1906 at the National Gallery.
People flocked to the National Gallery to see her. A legend had built up about this artist, this Spanish artist from the 17th century, and people queued to see her.
The men used to like to go and see it. First of all, they could get a sneak at some flesh, and the women used to like to go and see it because they felt empowered by it. You know, I'm turning my back on you blokes.
For the next decade, all the millions of people who came to look at her were met by the Rokeby Venus's unchanging gaze. But the world beyond her eyeline was changing. The suffragette women's movement was at its height, fighting for the right to vote and against countless inequalities and prejudices.
There was no television, there was no internet. If a man wanted to look at a naked woman and he didn't have a naked woman waiting for him at home, he could go to an art gallery and look at paintings of naked women. It's not surprising that the suffragettes got infuriated by this objectification of the naked woman, this deification of naked women in art galleries, whilst ignoring the realities and the real privations of women there in front of them in real life.
On March the 10th, 1914, the day after her leader Emmeline Pankhurst had been arrested in Glasgow, a former art student and militant suffragette, Mary Richardson, decided it was time to strike another blow for the cause.
She sort of plots her campaign very carefully. She decides to go into the National Gallery on one of the free days when there'll be lots of people around to witness her performing the act. She goes to the room and there are policemen seated in front of the Rokeby Venus.
What she had concealed about her person was some form of meat cleaver.
And she pretends to sort of sketch in a notebook, goes away to another gallery, come back, and she seizes her opportunity.
She went up to the Rokeby Venus,
takes the axe out of her bag, smashes the glass,
and she slashed at it with the cleaver.
7 times. It's really quite a sort of violent, quite a shocking act before people pounce upon her.
The guards were kind of racing around. Some of them slipped over, and by the time she was finally arrested, quite a lot of damage had been done to the painting. The attack on the Rokeby Venus got into all the newspapers, and the newspapers soon dubbed her Mary Slasher Richardson.
Her justification of it was that she wanted to attack this picture which everyone was admiring. All this fuss about a fictitious and unreal woman, whereas a real woman in our history who's making a real meaning from impact, Emmeline Pankhurst, is in prison and she's suffering.
After Mary Richardson was sentenced to 6 months in Holloway Prison, the National Gallery set to work repairing the damaged canvas. Even today, more than 100 years later, it remains a painting which divides opinion.
What is the power of the Rokeby Venus? I think the power is in what we don't see, what is left to the viewer's imagination. So again, this is a definition of a great artist here. Velázquez doesn't show us everything.
The Rokeby Venus remains a very controversial painting. Artists love it, particularly artists who paint and study the nude. It's a wonderful exercise in nude painting.
This voluptuous, simple-looking painting of a naked woman is a much, much cleverer picture than it first appears. I think it's not just a testament to Velázquez's talent and ambition, but above all, to his honesty. This is a painter who is prepared to portray gormless monarchs and vicious popes as they really were. And similarly, when he turns his attention to lust, he goes the extra mile. So yes, he has stripped Venus absolutely naked, but look at her face. Look at that expression of cold, withering contempt as she stares back at the male viewer. He has also stripped naked the male gaze, the voyeurism, the lust. I wonder if the patrons who bought this picture and enjoyed it in private even noticed. That is smart. That is painting.
Next time,
this colossal gallery doesn't just contain the most important painting in Dutch history, it was actually built around it.
there are exhilarating highs.
Rembrandt in those days was really like a superstar.
And crippling lows.
In spite of the fame Rembrandt achieved, he was buried in a pauper's grave.
Of Rembrandt's iconic Night Watch. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe,
there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power.
Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world?
All around the world, there are great galleries and museums crammed with beautiful art, which are open to everybody, free to all of us. Sometimes that's because of an act of national determination. Sometimes it's because of an individual bequest or legacy. When this one, Tate Britain, opened its doors first in 1897, it was the gift to the British of a Liverpool sugar merchant. Sir Henry Tate's great thing was sugar cubes, but his other great thing was British art, and he wanted to share his obsessive love of it with the rest of us.
Tate began this gallery with 65 of his own fine and memorable paintings, And at the heart of that collection, there was one particularly special piece.
It's been famous since before the gallery was built, and it's still its most popular picture. The Victorians loved it, and so do we. It is luscious, gorgeous to look at, but this is not a pretty story. It's a young, disturbed woman's suicide by drowning. I'm talking, of course, about John Everett Millais' Ophelia.
You'd need to be a cold fish not to be moved. Simultaneously beautiful and deeply shocking, Ophelia is the crowning achievement of one of the most skilled and ambitious painters of Victorian Britain.
Millais was considered an absolute genius with a paintbrush. He could do almost anything. Flowers fresh, flowers drenched and drowning. Little touches of sunlight on leaves, a face perfectly rendered, wet hair sinking into the water.
Others had painted Ophelia before, but nothing like this. It isn't stagey or really melodramatic. Here is a real woman, briefly suspended in living water, almost ecstatic in her despair. So who was this doomed and dying figure? How was Ophelia captured on canvas, and why does this image still hold such an important place in one of the greatest art collections in the world?
To really understand this image, we have to go back to the very beginnings of its life, because behind the romantic scene lies a much darker and more revolutionary story.
It's a tale of a major artistic rebellion, of ruthless ambition, and Victorian macabre. But before all of that, we start decorously in a far more conventional setting, just 2 miles from where Ophelia now hangs, in the place that mattered most to any aspiring Victorian painter, the Royal Academy of Arts. It was here, in December 1840, that an extraordinary young painter was first introduced to the Victorian art scene.
Millais was a child prodigy. He went to art school at a very young age, and he got into the Royal Academy when he was just 11 years of age.
He was the youngest ever person to attend the Royal Academy as a student. Prior to that, the youngest had been Turner, who went at the age of 14, which in itself was quite prodigious.
That's a record the young Millais still holds today. The Royal Academy was the only place to gain an art education. But to survive there, the young prodigy would have to bend himself to its rigor, its traditions, and above all, its taste.
You were told very much what you had to do, what paint palette you were allowed to use, what subject matter was appropriate for the stage of your learning.
You were meant to be painting portraits, landscapes, genre painting, often perhaps with some kind of moral tale.
Many artists were frustrated by the fact that the teachings of Joshua Reynolds, who died in 1792, were still being taught as the only way to look at art.
But even with these traditionalist teaching techniques, from the beginning, Millais' exceptional eye for detail, the very skill that would shine through in his Ophelia, won him fame and applause.
Millais was a great success at the Royal Academy. Even though he only went in when he was 11, he was winning awards and medals for his drawings and his paintings.
There's a wonderful picture of the Duke of Sussex handing the young Millais his silver medal, and he can hardly see Millais because he's so small. He has to bend down to this little boy who's shown with his lovely gold hairs and his little pantaloons.
Millais excelled at history paintings, big canvases depicting moral themes from well-known stories of the past. In 1846, he exhibited Pizarro seizing the Inca of Peru, and 1 year later, at just 18 years old, he received a gold medal for his painting The Tribe of Benjamin seizing the daughters of Shiloh. By the men at the top, he was adored, and yet, behind its closed doors, Millais was becoming increasingly frustrated with this cramping institution.
Revolutions in art tend to happen after a time of stagnation.
And in the 1840s, British painting was frankly in a poor way. Most of the greats, including Constable, were dead. And apart from the elderly Turner, then thought to be in his decline, there was nobody for the young Millais to look up to, which was a great stroke of luck, because it meant he had to rely on his own resources, think harder, and make his own way. Well, I say his own way, but not entirely, because in a second stroke of luck, he was surrounded by a group of equally impatient and almost as talented friends. Two other young artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt, shared Millais' frustrations with the revered Royal Academy.
They began to be rather critical. They felt that all the students were coming out and they were producing these rather brown, lacklustre paintings, which had no real connection to the society in which they were living.
And like all artists, they wanted to go their own way. They wanted to show their own talent.
So in 1848, the trio vowed to work together, igniting an extraordinary period of creativity. Aged just 19 years old, the teenage Millais was about to transform the story of British painting forever and create an image that would shock the mid-Victorian establishment. John Everett Millais' Ophelia is one of the oldest and most popular pieces in Tate Britain's collection.
This painting is so photoreal, so throbbing with vivid, lush colour, that it's hard to remember it owes nothing at all to any camera or lens, but was painted meticulously by hand in the depths of Victorian London more than 150 years ago. It packs an immediate punch. It looks different because it was meant to look different. It was the product of an artistic plot or conspiracy, if you like, that shook the Victorian art world.
And it all began in the summer of 1848 in this small, nondescript house in central London, with three daring young chancers, all under the age of 22. John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and the hot-headed, flashy painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
So these are young rebels. They want to cause a stir, a reaction, and they are defiantly rejecting what they had been taught by an older generation.
They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and even the name was a provocation. The now stale influence of the great Renaissance master Raphael was being cast off by the bold young radicals as a counter-revolution of spirituality based on naturalism now began.
It was very brave of the PRBs to do what they actually did, forming themselves and going against the Royal Academy, but they really believed in themselves.
These young artists who knew they were going to be provocative and they were going to be shocking to the public named themselves PRB, the little initials in the corner, so it's almost like a secret society.
A lot of academicians were really upset and they were quite shocked. You know, we've trained these students and this is what they're producing. They're rejecting us. These artists dismissing these time-honoured conventions of painting.
Within weeks, more like-minded young artists, fascinated by this radical new approach, joined Millais, Rossetti and Hunt. In their paintings, the rebellion unleashed an entirely new palette, paving the way for Millais' Ophelia.
The Pre-Raphaelite movement was revolutionary because their pictures just looked so different to everything else on display. The works were vivid and bright, with colours placed in juxtaposition.
They tried to show things as they really were. One of their tenets was truth to nature. So they would go outside, they would paint in the open air, and they would faithfully record everything that they saw. This was hugely radical.
So their pictures did actually look different, and they immediately demanded attention.
This revolutionary new society made their first big splash with Millais' attention-demanding Christ in the House of His Parents. Now displayed in Tate Britain, it's one of the artist-educator Richard Thomas's favourite pieces.
It went on show at the Royal Academy annual exhibition in May 1850, and he was 20 years old, so this is his coming-of-age exhibition. The first thing that happened for people looking at it was that they were drawn into responding to the subject in the painting as if it was an incident in a perfectly ordinary carpenter's workshop. But that's not just a little boy who's cut his hand. This is the Holy Family with Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, and Mary's mother, St. Anne.
Everything about this painting reflected the new and almost extremist principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Millais decided to paint the picture not in his studio, but on location in an actual carpenter's workshop in order to give the authentic feel. To get the effect of the vivid blood, Millais actually cut his own hand. You can see the chipped and dirty toenails of St. Joseph.
He thought this was one of his masterpieces. And until this time, Millais had been adored, so he didn't expect to really get a backlash. But in general, people took against this painting. One of the biggest problems was that Millais had portrayed the Holy Family as working class. This was really, really shocking to people. They didn't like it.
It's failing to do what people expect of a religious painting. It's failing to illustrate the sacred text. It's inserting an additional story. It's daring in a number of ways.
The Virgin Mary is not represented as some beautiful Raphaelesque type. She's shown us as a woman who looks rather sort of haggard and grief-stricken. It would seem to be blasphemous.
Ignoring all the pallid Madonnas and cute Christs that had come before him, Millais' religious realism was entirely unexpected. The Victorians already had a mental image of the Holy Family, and they hadn't looked like this.
One of the biggest critics of this particular painting was Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens was not an art critic. However, he had an awful lot of sway.
And his criticism is utterly hostile. He describes the Christ child as a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy with a bedgown. The Virgin is described as a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England. So he's utterly dismissive of this coarse realism.
The Pre-Raphaelites may only recently have been founded, but thanks to Millais, their reputation was already shot to pieces. News of the scandal even reached Queen Victoria, who demanded to see Millais' blasphemous work for herself. The young artist was devastated.
After the shock of the reception of Christ in the house of his parents, Millais was determined to make the art world love him again, to get his reputation back. He wasn't going to compromise, but he was going to make sure that his next painting was adored.
And for that, there was no better place for Millais to turn than the theatre.
Theatre was very popular. When people went out for entertainment, they went to the theatre, and Shakespeare was extremely popular.
It was a bit of everything that the Victorians liked. There was death involved, there was love involved, a bit of almost eroticism.
The Victorian public adored their Shakespeare. Even those who couldn't read had been to the theatre and were well versed in his stories. So as a topic for story painting, Shakespeare was a shrewd choice, especially as Millais plucked out one of the most dramatic moments in one of the most popular plays of them all.
So this is the famous moment in Shakespeare's Hamlet when Hamlet's beloved Ophelia decides to kill herself. She has been driven mad because Hamlet appears no longer to love her and has been mocking her in a rather cruel way, and he has just killed her father. So for her, life is over.
It was a really popular subject with artists. A lot of artists known to Millais, Arthur Hughes, Richard Redgrave, had painted the death of Ophelia. But they'd done it in a picturesque way, where she's sort of just tripping over the bank and stepping into the water.
Millais, however, took a closer look at Shakespeare's immortal lines.
Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto the element. But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death.
Snatches of old songs, the waterlogged dress, inconsolable in her misery. Bound by the Brotherhood's rules, Millais wanted to bring all of this vividly to life. But to do that, he needed the perfect poor wretch, a model whose face he dearly hoped would become unforgettable. The answer to his Ophelia was a young hat seller called Lizzie Siddal.
Lizzie Siddal was working in a milliner's shop just off Leicester Square in London. And she was a rather unusual-looking woman for her time. She was a young woman who was very, very slim.
Long red hair, very pale skin, very tall. She was discovered by Millais' friend who went to the milliner's and saw her and just thought she'd be perfect for the Pre-Raphaelites. And she became their model. But she was also an artist in her own right.
She was quite intellectual and loved poetry, painting.
Rossetti loved her, Millais loved her. Everybody wanted to paint her.
She essentially became the Pre-Raphaelite supermodel.
Millais now had his Ophelia, but how would he transform a 22-year-old Victorian hat seller into his doomed Shakespearean? How could he bring his canvas to life unless his model lived and breathed her distress? Ophelia and her watery suicide had to feel real. It was the beginning of a painstaking process as carefully planned as any military maneuver.
It wasn't just the figure that was important, so like Ophelia. The background was just as important.
The scene in Hamlet takes place in a remote corner of Denmark, but Millais needed somewhere a little handier for central London. Today, his great-great-grandson, art historian Dr. Roger Bowdler, is retracing Millais' steps for the first time.
Oh, my goodness. It's just a fabulous feeling, actually having found the precise spot where he spent weeks and weeks and weeks in the summer of 1851 painting Ophelia, and it's here. And this isn't the most romantic or glamorous of settings. You know, you can hear the M3 in the background, it's in the edge of Greater London, and it's covered in litter. But actually, that almost makes the magic of the picture the greater. The drama is about her imminent sinking below the water. So he doesn't want a grand, picturesque setting. He wants rather a modest riverbank to paint, and that's just what he finds.
To work outside, Millais capitalized on two exciting new innovations: small portable paint tubes and a host of new pigments and colors. His Ophelia would be the brightest canvas he'd ever produced, but working for so long outdoors still brought with it a whole catalogue of challenges.
He would spend up to 11 hours a day in great discomfort. He complained about the flies, about being threatened by a big bull.
He had farmers shouting at him. People would come past and ask him what he was doing.
And he has to deal with this pair of swans. They take up station just where he's found his spot and completely muck up the water weeds that he's so carefully selected for the setting of the painting.
Millais wrote, "My martyrdom is more trying than any I have hitherto experienced. Certainly, the painting of a picture under such circumstances would be a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging." These were the lengths the Pre-Raphaelites were willing to go to in order to capture nature as truthfully as possible.
He paints with fantastic finesse, which is why it takes him so long. So he begins work on this in early July. He's still here in early December.
He would say that it was like completing the size of a 5-penny piece each day. So that gives you a sense of how slow and gradual this process was.
He's putting his all into it because his reputation depends on success. So there's a discipline at work, along with the very romantic, poetic engagement of this poignant scene of watery death in this river.
But while Millais himself was more than happy to suffer for his art, even he realized that persuading Lizzie to dunk herself for hours in the cold and dirty waters of a Thames tributary might be going a little too far. And so back in central London, he came up with a somewhat less unpleasant alternative, but only somewhat.
Millais poses her in his studio, in his parents' house, in a bathtub, and he finds in an antique shop a beautiful antique dress with silver embroidery. Elizabeth Siddal is posed wearing this in the bathtub.
Now, Lizzie was being painted in December, long before central heating, and it was cold. It was in a basement studio. The lamps underneath the bath were kept lit in order to keep the water at an even temperature. But one day, Millais didn't notice that the lamps had gone out. The water, of course, just got colder and colder, and Lizzie lay there, the perfect artist model, suffering for his art as he completed his picture.
Millais' quest for realism had given his muse pneumonia. But although he was forced to pay for Lizzie's doctor's bills, there may have been a dark part of him that was quietly and privately pleased.
I think that the fact that Lizzie Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism and naturalism to the face that he painted while she was lying there in the bath, freezing.
Millais had thrown everything at this piece, stretching himself to the limits of his already extraordinary abilities. And yet it had almost cost the life of his model, and even after months of toil, he still wasn't finished. This was perhaps his last chance to not only save his reputation, but that of his fellow Pre-Raphaelites. So would his Ophelia be the great hit that Millais craved? John Everett Millais' Ophelia, the jewel in Tate Britain's collection, may be one of the most popular pieces of art of the 19th century, but it's definitely not for everyone.
There is something about this picture, perhaps its extreme prettiness, a dash of sentimentality that does not quite work for me. Perhaps I'm already too old. That is, when I first started looking at paintings and loving paintings back in the 1970s, modernism was all the rage, and Victorian pictures telling stories were deeply unfashionable. But we all have to challenge our prejudices, don't we? And it may be, strange thought, unlikely thought, that I am completely wrong.
And with this iconic canvas and its exquisite detail all to myself, it's very hard not to appreciate the sheer artistry.
So first of all, this is about two things for which the Pre-Raphaelites are very well known. Rich, luscious, almost enameled colour, and a detail so sharp you could cut your fingers on it. Where in the history of art have you ever seen a green as greeny as that green? Not since the very early Renaissance, I think. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the detail of the foliage is extraordinary. At times, he must have been using a brush with a single hair.
And so, yes, perhaps, I may have been a little hasty. Looking again with fresh eyes, the subject is creepy, but it's impossible not to admire the way Millais makes his colours glow and his brushes dance. A touch of blue here, a flicker of white there. He applies shades and highlights with nerveless accuracy.
He managed somehow, with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites, to wash and rinse the colours so they glowed more freely and brightly than they had for a very, very long time. And they astonished the Victorians, and frankly, they are still astonishing us today.
there is this remarkable kind of hyper-real quality in the painting. And one of the ways he achieved this effect was to use a white ground, using lead white and zinc white. And the effect of that was to create this kind of backlit quality to these very bright primary colors that he's using.
And the wonderful passages of observation, there's two hands which sort of stand out like pieces of collage on the canvas. And it really conveys the impression of, this water just sinking into the dress. It's just dragging her bit by bit under the water.
The Pre-Raphaelites' hopes for a new art live in every inch of this canvas. It throbs with zest and confidence. It is everything the movement had hoped painting could be. It took Millais months, but finally, in early 1852, Ophelia was finished.
The question for Millais was now, was it worth it? Would the Victorian public feel half as strongly about this astonishing picture as did the artist himself?
When the painting went on display at the Royal Academy in 1852, there was a very mixed reaction, actually.
Some people thought it was a very unconventional representation of Ophelia. Someone described her death as if she were in a weedy ditch. Others felt it was just too bright, vivid and gaudy.
There was so much going on, so much symbolism, that viewers almost had to work at it. They had to study it really hard. And at first, people were a little bit shocked, but within a very short time, it was applauded.
People thought Millais has really captured something quite extraordinary. Tom Taylor, who wrote for The Times, when he saw the face of Ophelia, he just described himself as just crying with emotion because he'd made the death so beautiful.
Millais' masterpiece had been quickly snapped up by a private collector, but while it remained on public display, Ophelia proved to be a huge draw. And whether they liked it or not, the Royal Academy could no longer cast out its arrogant prodigal son.
The painting is really important in terms of Millais' career. It marks a watershed. Suddenly, his paintings become emotional, and he becomes seen as a painter of pathos and empathy. And there are accounts of people just become overcome with emotion at seeing Ophelia. And at that point, his reputation changes. And from this point onwards, it's really an upward trajectory.
Just a year after Ophelia was displayed, Millais was chosen as an Academy Associate, an act which would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The establishment he had rejected and which had loudly rejected him was suddenly embracing the stiff-backed young radical. But if Ophelia had been about tapping into popular taste, then, unfortunately, Millais now didn't know when to stop.
So from 1853 onwards, Millais starts to feel that he doesn't have to stick entirely to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's principles. He sticks to a lot of them, but he starts to experiment.
He becomes a highly successful commercial artist, a painter of genre scenes, of landscapes. His style relaxes, but also I think he becomes just bored, dissatisfied with that pre-Raphaelite, very finicky manner. He wants to develop as an artist. Artists always have to change and evolve.
He became a fashionable portraitist, painting rich people's portraits, and a lot of artists said that he sold out, but he was making a living.
Most of the public just loved him. They couldn't get enough of Millais. He started to paint a lot of crowd-pleasing pictures, often of little children, because that was the fashion.
He becomes the darling of the British public.
A revolutionary no longer, Millais' later work, which even included a saccharine advert for Pear's soap, bore no relation to his Pre-Raphaelite canvases. He became firmly part of the establishment. In 1896, aged 67, he was even elected Royal Academy President. But whereas Ophelia had once represented the peak of the Pre-Raphaelite movement in all its non-conformist glory, now it marked the beginning of their demise. Holman Hunt, and the increasingly eccentric Rossetti would be left to forge their own paths, and their great muse Lizzie, immortalised in their paintings, would begin a terrifying parallel trajectory in real life. Millais' painting had almost killed her, and now she was going to become Ophelia-like in an entirely new way.
People clamoured to come and see this painting. And in fact, for Lizzie Siddal, in some ways, it was a double-edged sword. She became very famous because of it.
Through her association with Rossetti, she really begins to pick up her art again, painting and drawings, often portraying scenes of lovers or couples in complicated psychological situations. She also starts to write her own poetry and verse.
Lizzie was a sophisticated Pre-Raphaelite artist in her own right, much more than the model in the movement's most iconic piece. But her relationship with Rossetti was incredibly tempestuous. He was a serial cheat, and Lizzie didn't make the easiest partner herself.
Perhaps the biggest problem in their relationship on her side was that she was a laudanum addict. And laudanum was an opiate. It was opium in alcohol, incredibly addictive. And it was a real social ill of the 19th century, particularly amongst women.
Depressed, unappreciated, and darkly miserable, Lizzie could not control her addiction. And tragically, on the 11th of February 1862, aged just 32, she killed herself with a suspected overdose.
People have often associated the tragic early death of Elizabeth Siddal with the early death of Ophelia. So there is this conflation between art and life. That's what's so sort of magical and sort of, slightly sort of sinister or uncanny about Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Often art and life do converge.
When Lizzie was buried, Rossetti did a very romantic gesture. He placed in her coffin, between her cheek and her hair, his only copy of his poems that he'd written. He claimed that they were all about her, that love had died with her. He was deeply grief-stricken.
With Ophelia sold and in private hands, the Pre-Raphaelites disbanded, and Millais now creating mainstream art for the masses, it looked as if the importance and significance of this remarkable painting would start to fade.
But neither Lizzie Siddal nor Millais' Ophelia were going to be forgotten, because something was about to happen in that graveyard which would lodge the young model and the painting deep in the Victorian popular imagination.
Millais' great canvas, Ophelia, has continued to capture our imagination almost 170 years since it was first exhibited. And I think that's in part because its subject matter transcends any age or any era.
There is no moment in the human story so cold, so lonely, and so bleak as deciding to take your own life. Ophelia killed herself because she had been so badly betrayed she was demented. And she did it in a particularly grim way.
But what also added to the intrigue, mystery, and perhaps the popularity of this canvas was that it was an act reflected by the untimely death of Millais' own muse. And Victorian Britain would be aghast at what happened next.
Lizzie Siddal was buried in Highgate Cemetery, Rossetti's handwritten poetry tucked neatly behind her long flowing red hair. But this tragic woman was not going to be allowed to rest in peace, because just 6 years later, Rossetti decided that he wanted his poetry back, which was tricky, because you could hardly dig her up again. Or could he?
By 1869, Rossetti couldn't bear the thought of his Pre-Raphaelite poetry being lost to the world any longer. And so alongside his friend Charles Augustus Howell, he hatched a macabre plan to retrieve the poems from Lizzie's grave.
They'd done it by bonfire light, and the coffin had been exhumed, and the lid had been taken off. And allegedly, according to Howell, there was Lizzie perfect. She wasn't a skeleton, she was miraculously preserved. He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin. Rossetti wanted to believe it, that Lizzie was the beautiful supermodel in death, just as she'd been in life.
Rossetti published the poems, which he'd received with a wormhole running through them. They didn't go down well. By the time he died 13 years later, he was a thin spectre of the man who'd helped found the Pre-Raphaelites back in 1848. And yet, a mythology began to grow around the image of Lizzie, captured for eternity as the epitome of the betrayed woman.
She's sort of a heroine for women that suffered at the fate of drugs and men and being a muse.
A lot of women now model themselves on Elizabeth Siddal, and the Elizabeth Siddal look is now rather fashionable. If you think of performers such as Florence Welsh with the red hair, pale complexion, the flowing garments.
Perhaps one reason why Lizzie Siddal still captures the imagination is that her own suicide is so neatly captured in the painting of her by Millais as Ophelia. The fact that she was the most famous suicide in art history and then becomes a suicide in real life is something that continues to resonate with people.
There's no denying this is a great Victorian horror story. But Lizzie Siddal, the face of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, should not be remembered just as a beautiful victim.
We look at Lizzie Siddal in this picture, and she is entirely passive, almost surrendered. And we have to remember that this was a woman who, in her real life, was an artist and a writer, a poet herself. It is a great, great injustice that the way we remember her is only as a passive, sinking woman in a famous painting and as a corpse being ravaged for somebody else's poetry long after her death.
And yet, even now, Lizzie couldn't quite rest in peace. The painting of Ophelia had vanished into the private art world not long after it had been completed. But now it had reached the eye of one very important man.
In 1892, Henry Tate purchases the picture. Henry Tate is a sugar magnate. He's made his fortune from sugar refining. He patents the sugar cube.
There was only one thing that Tate loved more than sugar: art, and in particular, Pre-Raphaelite art. Over the last few years, he'd collected an extraordinary number of paintings, and now he wanted to share them with the nation.
He loved the idea of a national gallery that people of all social classes could go to.
A site is decided upon, which is the old Millbank Penitentiary. It's a site which will be transformed into this public gallery, which will be free of charge for the public, particularly for the working poor of the Millbank area.
A cutting-edge art gallery in one of the poorest areas of the city. That was a mighty risk. The question on everyone's lips was, would Ophelia help pull in big crowds? And the answer was a resounding yes.
The gallery opens in 1897, and Ophelia is an immediate hit with the public. People flock to see it.
It was one of those that people were told to sort of stand back, don't jostle. They had to have a lot of guards checking that people didn't get too close to the painting, and it's remained one of the most successful paintings of the Tate ever since.
This haunting canvas has spoken to generation after generation since it was first hung here more than 120 years ago.
Millais' Ophelia is a masterwork by a master painter. He was a young revolutionary taking on the establishment, and then, very quickly, the perils of success. He became the establishment himself, and he was much mocked for turning out cute, sentimental pictures, some of them used in advertising as sweet as any sugar cube manufactured by Sir Henry Tate himself. But this here still shows all his defiance and his optimism. It is a young man's shout hanging on these establishment walls. No, I still don't love it, but I salute it for its vividness and its energy. And anyway, Ma, you old fool, the rest of the world disagrees.
Next time.
This was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors.
The story of a ravishing beauty and the revolution she stirred.
He would have put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
This could only be Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus.